This presentation I will talk about how Hoccleve's mental state affects interpretations of his poems. The main subject of Hoccleve's series seems to be recovery, as he is very intent on making sure the public will finally believe he is now fully cured from his period of madness. For this reason, his mental state is a very popular subject amongst critics, and the interpretation of the text changes based on whether one actually believes that he is recovered or not. Despite Hoccleve's many attempts in the series to assert his own sanity, one still would have plenty of reason for doubt. Firstly, as a modern reader, the idea that one can simply be cured from mental illness seems rather improbable. With our current understanding of mental illnesses, we know that a person can't simply just be cured from it, but rather it takes years and years of work. Secondly, there is textual evidence that casts doubts on whether he is truly recovered. For example, as Goldie points out, the word last in the line "Isse velcithin ivi sickness last was scourged" could actually imply that this was not the first time he has had an illness like this. And Goldie also points out that Hoccleve states that he has been hesitant to write recently over the last 2 months because sickness and unlust and other more han be the causes of impediment. And this fragment is a part of the dialogue. To admit he still has a long-standing, even recurring sickness contradicts his argument for recovery in the complaint. And it also sort of establishes Hoccleve, or the person in the poem, as untruthful, as dishonest. According to Stephanie Trigg, in her TED Talk, she says, what upsets Hoccleve most when he is recovering from his madness is the sense that his co-workers and his friends will not look him in the eye and will not believe that he is better. And he is really frustrated by this. He keeps talking on about how no one will believe me and how everyone is still talking about him. But if we do assume that Hoccleve is indeed still suffering from mental illness, we cannot truly blame the friend and the people he meets for not believing he is recovered, as we don't really believe it ourselves. This also might lessen our ability to truly sympathise with Hoccleve, and might also make us question the truth of everything else in the poems, as he has already been dishonest about his sanity. Whereas if we assume that he is indeed recovered, and his friends still do not believe him, our ability to sympathise with him might grow, especially since the behaviour of his friends towards him is truly sad, as they have been said to actually flee from him. In the complaint, it was said, they bet me say, fleden away from me. So they actually fled from him, which is not what any good friend should do, no matter the circumstances. However, if we assume that his mental state is affecting the interpretation of his poems, it brings along another problem, since we then also have to assume that these poems are autobiographical, whereas if we believe that the person in the poems is not an actual replica of the author, Hoccleve's mental state should not even matter for any interpretation of the poems. Critics tend to be divided on the subject, some believing the narrator and author should not be conflated, and others feel that the series do have to be read as an autobiography. Simpson is quick to establish a difference between narrator and author in his essay, saying, the narrator of Hoccleve's complaint is presented as having experienced a period of madness. So in this first line of his essay, he already portrays the person in the poem as the narrator and not Hoccleve himself. However, it is still very easy to read the poems as autobiographical, which Simpson also acknowledges, as he refers to the passage where Hoccleve is talking about a book that brought him comfort and says, we might, not unreasonably, understand this as an autobiographical reference, since the narrator is called Thomas Hoccleve, and he is presented as a poet with the same profession, a clerk in the office of the Privy Seal, as the historical Hoccleve. This interpretation of the text as not autobiographical is further reinforced by the fact that Hoccleve himself reminds us of the textuality of the poem when during the dialogue the complaint is presented to us as a text, as he is reading to his friend the complaint that we have also just read. To conclude, interpretation of the poems is based on a multitude of aspects, the first being whether one believes Hoccleve is sane or not, and the second being whether we should read the text as autobiographical or not. There is not just one good interpretation, but many different possibilities, and even if one believes the narrator and the author should not be conflated, interpretation of the poems could still change based on whether people believe the narrator is actually cured from his illness or not. Based on these aspects, one can either sympathise more with Hoccleve or less.